The world was blue up here. The color itself was infinite, a tapestry pulled taut, stretching in all directions across both sides of the horizon. Blue was empty, and cold, and inescapable. A pale wake chased relentlessly after the plane, the only disturbance to a perfectly lifeless seascape. Relaxing his grip on the pommel of the borrowed MiG fighter, Gregory flexed his back and shoulders, the worn muscles complaining from the small break in their vigilance. Taking a moment to catalog the extent of his pains and injuries, Gregory tried to uncoil his nerves, never quite taking his eyes off the skyline. A small lapse traveling at Mach 17 a few feet above the crests of the waves could spell only disaster. A glance at his heightometer read it a steady 50 feet. The perils presented by those dark depths were not the only danger, however. Every ship, plane, and kid on a bicycle this side of the operations line would have a picture of his face by now. Flying low would keep him off radar, but he was by no means invisible. His altitude and bearing wouldn't look at all subtle to a border patrol ship, and it would only take a nosy independent fisher radioing back to shore for Gregory to have half the Eastern Sky Armada shooting across his nose. He was a lonely little mouse, skittering through a hungry lion's cage at the zoo. He could only pray for more of clear waters and empty skies. Gregory drew in a deep breath, creating a small room in the back of his mind. A windowless room, plain white, with only a simple table at its center. On that table, Gregory placed his doubts and fears. The low fuel gauge scrawled in alien curls and slashes on his heads-up display. The impending war that would surely come in response to his actions. The innumerable eyes that now scanned the heavens, looking for their own notoriety at the end of a 100 caliber barrel. When the table was covered with the mess of his thoughts, Gregory stepped back through the door, closing it, letting go of the thinning air. Calmness settled on him. The knot in his stomach began to untie itself, and the cockpit stopped getting smaller. Without any clear reason, Gregory's eyes fell on the storage compartment, a small glove-like recess that was occupied by an unceremonious package. It was wrapped in a thin covering of gray cloth with a myriad of foreign characters scrawled across each face. He had held it in his hands, the weight and size disguising the grave importance contained within, the potential to save countless lives resting within those simple folds. Failure is not an option, Gregory whispered to himself. Not with everything that was on the line. He would deliver this package, whether by plane or by paddle was of no consequence. Gregory felt a fresh wave of panic surge in his stomach as the radar came screaming to life. Fighting the urge to kick in the afterburners and race like a madman to the rendezvous, Gregory maintained course. Panicking would only give them reason to chase, and his fuel level would be depleted long before he reached friendlier waters. The radar screen now held two angry red dots, staring up at him like eyes, awaiting recognition. Only a matter of minutes until they were close enough for ID, but the seconds seemed to tick by just like the days before Christmas. Steeling himself, Gregory eased back on the accelerator and paused, his other hand over the weapon safety. Too soon yet to tell who or what his guests were. 100 kilometers, 80 kilometers. A glimmer of hope crept into Gregory's thoughts. What if the Cicero had pushed further in? These could be reconnaissance scouts, ready to guide him home. A cold sweat broke out all over Gregory's body as his skin crawled with anticipation. 50 kilometers, 35 kilometers. Too fast. Too fast. They're coming in too fast, Gregory mumbled to himself. 20 kilometers. No chance these birds were friendly. They were coming in too hot. Gregory's hand hovered, still poised over the safety. The timing for this would be critical. 17 kilometers. 13 kilometers. 8 kilometers. The shrill chirp of the enemy weapons lock announced the new arrival's intentions. Popping the safety and pulling back on the stick, Gregory climbed into a 0-degree ascent. Unable to decelerate fast enough, the two fighters flew right past, already arcing around to shadow him into the clouds. The pull of the sudden acceleration and the drastic skyward climb was like a punch to the lungs. Gregory felt like he was being crushed, gravity and velocity having a death match right on his chest. Climbing higher and higher into the swirling white mists, Gregory could feel each heartbeat throughout his body. The strain was almost unbearable, taking every bit of his training not to pass out. Finally reaching the ceiling of 10,000, Gregory straightened. The two fighters were eating up the distance behind him now. Taking a few steadying breaths, Gregory steered towards where they would appear out of the clouds. Punching down the accelerator, Gregory rocketed back down, straight at the enemy. He was flying blind through plumes of feathery white with only his radar to guide him. Closer and closer, trusting completely to his nav system and the surprise of his pursuers, Gregory flew in a kamikaze dive right at the enemy fighters. The shrill chirp sounded again, distorted as from the inside of a glass jar. This time Gregory had his own lock. The chirp turned into a long, piercing beep as Gregory fired his own missile, pulling hard left on the stick. There was an eternity in seconds before the heavens erupted in fire. The call of the oncoming missile continued, faster and louder, as the noise and images of the world warbled. Gregory braced for the impact, only to hear the sound die. The missile had flown right past, unable to match the speed and trajectory of his path. A ballsy maneuver, but he'd lived to tell about it. The remaining pilot had already broken off, veering northeast, no doubt retreating to summon reinforcements. Gregory flipped a few switches on the console, and a buzzing vibration filled the air. Hopefully his radio jammer was close enough to cut off communications. Pushing the limits to how much fuel he was willing to spend to remain undetected, Gregory raced after the rogue plane in the direction from which he had been fleeing only minutes ago. Sweat dripped from Gregory's forehead as his fingertips slid over the trigger. The tat-tat-tat-tat of the machine gun burst echoed across his skin, making the hairs stand even further on end. The next sound from the monitor made Gregory's heart sink. Another red dot appeared at the edge of his radar screen, and another, and another. Soon, it was an unbroken line of red, a bloody tide oozing down his radar screen. A quick glance at his resources made the situation look even more grim. No more missiles, low on bullets. Fuel was at fumes by now. By the shape of things, he might be getting wet after all. Gregory spun the bird around and flew in the direction that he prayed would lead to the Cicero as the armada poured after him. The cockpit was awash with beeps and screams, buzzers and sounds. Gregory would never be able to outmaneuver all those missiles. The noise continued, though more and more they started to resemble car horns. The unsubtle shout of frustrated motorists. But up here? Trying to focus on the mission was becoming harder. The mission. What was the mission? Gregory couldn't think with the noise that was growing louder around him. As suddenly as Cicero Avenue had become the hostile far ocean, it was once again transformed into an ocean of dull tarmac. Cars were moored together in a stretch of roadway that gridlocked for at least a mile. Traffic lurched by in spurts, the inconsistent flow producing honks and gestures from even the slightest hesitancy. Profanities hung in the air like a stale perfume, adding a vulgar taste to the otherwise choking aroma of rush hour traffic. Looking around, Gregory saw that the Kingdom Burger parking lot had changed very little in the space of his high-flying endeavors. The minivans of the afternoon had been replaced with the sedans and SUVs of the evening, and the matte black Astro that came through every day around 5 was just departing. The sun was still clawing its way around rain clouds, the weatherman had failed to mention, but it hung considerably lower now. The cockpit seat was gone. Instead, the hard edges of the concrete bumper were making Gregory's tailbone go numb. He was no longer the feared menace of the skies, the harbinger of the East, the terror of terrorists. He was back to being the lowly cook, fryer of potato sticks and griller of square burgers. Gregory Heinz, the ketchup man. An inbound plane interrupted his senses as it roared its landing at the airport down the street. Reaching down, Gregory found that the package has transformed as well. It was no longer the computer component that would save the system, or the antidote that would cure millions, or anything like that. Its enigmatic folds were plastic now, the archaic text a ridiculous smiley face with the words "Thank you" printed below it in yellow. The answer to the world's greatest threat was now just a couple of movies. The answer to tonight's boredom. The adrenaline had all floated away by now. The rumbling of idle engines, chasing away the soundtrack in his head, the explosions, the tat-tat-tat of automatic guns, the rock and roll playlist of countless dogfight movies. As if on cue, a horn blared out of the chorus of combustion engines, spoiling the humdrum melody with repellent excitement. The blast was followed by another, and shouts of furious indignation. An old tan Plymouth had cut across the middle lane, now sitting locked between the two. The drivers stuck behind were bellowing red-faced phrases that, although Gregory couldn't discern over the commotion of traffic, he was sure would leave their mothers reaching for the soap. A pretty girl sat in the driver's seat of the Plymouth, yelling back. Her short blonde hair fell in a sunny wave slightly past her ears, and the sleeveless sundress showed off the lean build of her arms and shoulders. Reaching her arms out of the open window, she hoisted herself into a sitting position on the door. Using her foot to stomp on the horn, she looked right at him and yelled, "Gregory, get your ass up and let's go." "Heather!" Gregory's mind finally snapped back from its weightlessness. Rolling forward on the cement, Gregory pushed himself to his feet, feeling the teetering numbness of walking on sleeping legs. Stumbling twice before he remembered the bag of movies on the ground where he had been sitting, Gregory wheeled back around to swoop them up, almost pitching forward as he did. The trot back to the car was terribly awkward, for the stares from all the other cars and the glare from the thick man behind the Plymouth. Gregory slid into the passenger seat, already wishing he could melt into the itchy upholstery. "Move that heap, you twat!" the man's voice bellowed. "Eat me, back fat," was her reply. A long note from the man's horn prompted Heather's hand to fly out the window. Gregory couldn't see it, but he could have guessed what sign language she was communicating to him. Whether it was his imagination or not, Gregory sank a little deeper into the seat. Heather never batted an eye. Traffic started to move, and suddenly all was right with the world again. After a few blocks of stopping and going, the chagrin from Gregory's face started to dissolve back into his bloodstream. Some kids in the back seat of a Civic would look at him once in a while, but the rest had moved on or forgotten the incident completely. "So, how was work?" Heather asked, punctuating the monotonous seesaw rocking of traffic. "Well," Gregory began. "Oh, but before you start, can you just leave out all the boring parts?" Heather injected. Gregory stopped to think for a moment, contemplating telling her the story of how he was in the middle of saving the world from a megalomaniac regime bent on enslaving the world and making example of Western society. Gregory thought better on it. Instead, he decided on just the Cliff Notes version of the day. "Well, you dropped me off for work this morning, and after that, you picked me up. Like just now." Heather sat staring ahead, holding the enormous steering wheel with her comparably tiny hands, a buffoonish gaping wonder pasted across her face. "No way," she breathed, her tone mocking disbelief. The light ahead changed, causing Heather to brake dramatically, throwing her hands up as to brace for an imaginary impact. "Oh my God, we almost died, Gregory." "I don't want to die a virgin. Take me now," she pleaded with a scandalous smirk. Gregory shook his head, smiling, the color returning a bit to his face. "A, you're not a virgin," Gregory said, prompting more melodramatic indignation. "And B, we have a reservation to keep." A long, exasperated sigh was Heather's rebuttal. "Well, it would be a great excuse why we didn't show. I'm sure it's one your parents would love to hear about." Her eyebrow hooked in a deliciously tempting arc. Reading Gregory's face for a moment or two, she conceded with a smile. "Well, if you're not going to put out, at least I want a kiss." Leaning over her, Gregory loomed like a giant to her small figure. Touching her face gingerly with his fingers, her lips tasted like vanilla, soft and sweet like candy. Satisfied for the moment, Heather turned her attention back to the green light. That smile lingered for the next few blocks. The stifling shuffle was beginning to break, as the sun sank further down. The orange globe was close to being swallowed by the teeth of the city's skyline. Exiting from the main thoroughway onto one of the countless side streets was a welcome change. No longer part of the homeward exodus of impatient refugees, they were now disappearing into the quiet repetition of the urban sprawl. Passing city block after city block of the same squat, cozy homes, this street named Pine, that one Oak, or some other uninspiringly deciduous variation. Each was filled with the same perfectly parceled out lawns, divided by ribbons of concrete and chain link fence. A few thousand mirrors repeating the image of the same warm brickwork and quaint porches, with a few lawn ornaments or stone ducks to make it just a little different from the rest. The recycling scenery drove Heather mad, but oddly enough it always soothed Gregory with its lack of surprises. With the press of traffic gone and the hum of engines fading, the car transitioned into a realm of near-mute calm. "Do we have to go tonight?" Heather asked abruptly, breaking the spell of the now quiet drive. Gregory had thought about the idea of canceling many times already. His parents would seldom let months go by without inviting him to dinner. What seemed like a request from the outside was all but a Supreme Court subpoena. "We would only be prolonging the inevitable," he replied, the events of the night before him already stirring up the darker aspects from his imagination, mixed with bits of past visits. In the corner of some dim restaurant, under careful scrutiny, they would barrage him with questions about what he was doing, where he was going in life. No answer he could give mattered. Gregory had come to realize at least that would satisfy the thirst they had for him to make something of himself. He would never live up to their expectations, not like his brother anyway. He knew it. They knew it. The evening was only a formality, like taxes or birthday cards. "Are you positive that it's tonight?" Heather poked. "Maybe there was a mistake at the calendar company, and we actually skipped a week. Or daylight savings time, right? Don't we set our clocks back one whole day?" The mischievous look was touched at the edge with a very real agitation. It made sense. She obviously wasn't looking forward to tonight either. If he was the main course for tonight's interrogation, what did that make her? Inconsequential? Immaterial? Unworthy of notice? "Actually, I think daylight savings time is next week, and that only puts us back an hour, not a whole day. And my parents already called to make sure we knew to be at the restaurant by 7. "But that's like in 45 minutes, Heather exclaimed, the green LED of the stereo confirming the hour. The pixiness of her smile was gone, replaced with a cloudy furrow on her brow. Gliding the Plymouth to the front of the apartment building, Heather slid right into an open parking space with the cursive ease of routine. The apartment building was itself as uneventful as the houses leading up to its perch at the end of the block, a larger version of much of the same. "Hurry up, then," she grumbled, swinging out of the wide car door. Gregory followed suit all the way up to the end of the damp, freshly cut rectangle of grass. It was there he locked eyes with a grizzly bear from across the yard. 300 pounds worth of Polish muscle and generous stock, squeezed down to the size of an 8th grader, trudged towards him. He was cursing in Russian or some other angry language, dragging the prehistoric version of what people would call a lawnmower today. Coming closer into view, Gregory could see the redness of his face, either boiling anger or sunburn, between clumps of green pulp. The arduous process made Gregory feel like he was awaiting his own execution. The black of the hangman covered Victor for a moment as he stepped beside a large shady tree, pulling what Gregory imagined would be the vehicle of his premature demise. Finally, close enough to look up at Gregory, Victor dropped the handle of the mower and scowled. "Where you go?" he growled very softly, eyes narrowing further down to points, directed right for the space between Gregory's eyes. He could only stare down at him, fumbling for words. The 8 inches of discrepancy did little to offset the sheer intimidation that Victor possessed. "Well, I had to work today," Gregory choked out. Victor looked up at him as if he were speaking in a made-up language. I ready to play Ivan and no grass cut. How I concentrate on Bishop when no grass cut? Victor demanded. His nostrils flared, and Gregory could only think he was smelling the fear on him, like a feral animal. You come to me, want money off rent. I say yes, but you no earn it. Grabbing the handle of the mower, Victor started to stomp off in the direction of the dilapidated garage at the far end of the yard, but stopped after just a few feet. Spinning back on Gregory, he had a kind of wily smile. I know. You fix toilet, he said. It wasn't a demand or a suggestion, but a certainty, with a lot of hard consonants. Call Miss Renee. She tell you. But I don't, Gregory started, immediately shut off by the look on the old man's face. He continued on, with no chance for protest, hauling the dull-bladed machine and cursing to himself. Gregory, get your ass in gear, came a shout from the third-floor apartment. Heather's pretty face smoldered from behind the screen, before disappearing again into the dimness of the apartment. Gregory only shook his head as he charged towards the door. Climbing the first two sets of stairs in the dusty twilight shadows, Gregory caught a ball of clothes in the face at the third landing, followed by the slamming of the door. Realizing what was happening, Gregory approached the door cautiously and knocked. The deadbolt replied, sliding into place on the other side. Heather, he tried to reason, I can't get dressed out here. Should have thought of that before you scheduled dinner at 7 o'clock and then proceeded to screw around outside, she called back from further in the apartment. Better hurry up unless you want to entertain your folks smelling like beef grease and onions. Standing atop the third-floor landing with an armful of clothes, it didn't look like Gregory had any other choice. Taking a moment to put his ear to Ms. Dowell's, the neighbor's door, he heard the faint voice of some haughty English personality from the TV in her foyer. Hopefully that dull accent kept her distracted enough from the yelling and door slamming, and she wouldn't come out to investigate. After about a minute of hearing no movement from inside, and feeling confident enough in his privacy, Gregory began to disrobe. The shirt peeled off of him, and did truly smell like the Kingdom Burger. He would need to be generous with the deodorant and cologne, or he would be smelling like cheeseburger the whole night. Kicking his shoes off, Gregory stumbled around, trying to get the pants off, while staying upright. Nimble had never been one of his better qualities. Gregory finally got the second leg out of the slacks, but tripped, catching his balance on the banister of the stairwell, just as Ms. Dowell came up the corner of the stairs. The cool autumn air of the hallway became a furnace in July, as Gregory could feel the blood filling his face with mortification. The shock registered in Ms. Dowell's face, eyebrows climbing halfway to her hairline, but only for a second as she regained her composure. I do wish you would find a more secluded setting for your romantic forays, she scolded. Stepping onto the landing, she walked past the near-naked Gregory and the pile of clothes strewn around him, pausing only to put her key in the door. Oh, do put your pants on, Gregory. You haven't got anything I haven't seen before, she chirped mirthlessly before closing the door behind her. Gregory could hear the thump, thump, thump of his pulse rocketing through his ears just over the snickering behind him. Heather stood in the open threshold, trying to fight back a maniac's grin. Her face was a shade redder than her normal color, but only just. Get in here, she commanded in between snorts of laughter, before any of the other neighbors get to look at your birthday suit. After much of the laughter had ceased, she added, Put your clothes on, we're going to be late.